It begins, as so many American tragedies do, with Christmas lights still twinkling on quiet suburban streets. Boulder, Colorado, December 26, 1996. The dawn after Christmas. The neighborhood of University Hill is still asleep beneath a soft blanket of snow, a world of calm and privilege, where homes sit proud against the foothills of the Rockies. In one of them, a sprawling Tudor-style house with its lights still glowing from the night before, something unspeakable has already happened. Inside that home, the Ramsey family, John, Patsy, their 6-year-old daughter JonBenét, and 9-year-old son Burke, had celebrated Christmas the day before. Gifts were opened, laughter echoed through the hallways, and the house filled with the soft smell of pine and perfume. There were friends, photos, and the glimmering innocence of a holiday that should have been ordinary. But by morning, that illusion would shatter forever. At 5:52 a.m., a frantic call pierced the quiet calm of the Boulder Police Department's dispatch line. A mother's trembling voice said her daughter was gone, kidnapped. There was a ransom note, long, bizarre and cruel, waiting on the back staircase of their home. When police arrived, the scene was strangely calm for a kidnapping. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no footprints in the snow outside. The ransom note demanded $118,000, an oddly specific amount, the same as John Ramsey's recent bonus from his company. The note warned the family not to contact anyone, not even the police. But they had already called. Friends soon flooded the house. Coffee brewed. People prayed and paced. Investigators came and went, unsure whether they were walking through a crime scene or a misunderstanding. Then hours later, in the basement of that same home, beneath the quiet hum of a house wrapped in chaos, John Ramsey made a discovery that would haunt America for decades to come. There, behind a latched door in a small dark utility room, lay the body of his 6-year-old daughter, a child once known to the world for her beauty pageant crowns and golden curls, now pale and still. A garrote fashioned from a length of cord and a broken paintbrush handle was wrapped around her neck. Her wrists were tied. Tape covered her mouth. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, a name that would soon become synonymous with mystery and tragedy, was dead. News traveled fast, reaching television networks by evening. A child beauty queen murdered in her own home, her parents wealthy and well-known. Their Christmas turned into a nightmare. The case had everything that made America stop and stare: innocence lost, privilege, beauty, and the uneasy feeling that evil had crept into a world that looked so perfect from the outside. Reporters camped outside the Ramsey home as police cordoned off the area. The nation's fascination ignited overnight. Who could do such a thing? And how had it happened inside a house filled with family comfort and security? The questions came fast. Why was the ransom note written on paper from the Ramsey home itself? How could no one have heard a struggle? Why did the timeline feel so fractured? Why did the crime scene seem staged? Within hours, suspicion began to swirl, not toward strangers, but toward the family themselves. Patsy Ramsey, the glamorous former beauty queen and devoted mother, whose trembling voice had carried through that 911 call. John Ramsey, the successful businessman whose composure seemed both dignified and cold. Even 9-year-old Burke, the quiet boy who had slept through the night of the murder, would soon become a subject of rumor. In the weeks that followed, what began as a tragedy became a media firestorm. The Ramseys went on television pleading for answers. The police searched their home again and again. Experts analyzed handwriting, DNA, and psychology. Talk shows debated guilt and innocence. America became obsessed, not just with the crime but with the image of a child who seemed to embody both beauty and vulnerability. JonBenét Ramsey became a symbol. Her smiling pageant photos, hair curled, face powdered, eyes bright, were plastered on every screen. But beneath the spectacle, a question lingered, heavier than any headline. If a little girl could be murdered in her own home, by someone she likely knew, What did that say about the world behind the white picket fences? Boulder, once known for its mountain calm and intellectual ease, now found itself at the center of one of the most confounding and divisive murder cases in American history. The police were unprepared, the media relentless. The truth, and whatever it was, began to sink beneath layers of speculation, ego, and fear. As days turned into months, the case twisted upon itself. Forensic mistakes were made, evidence was mishandled, accusations flew between detectives and district attorneys. Each revelation contradicted the last, until what was left was not a story of justice but a puzzle of human failure. Nearly 3 decades later, the case remains unsolved. The questions unanswered, the myths unbroken. JonBenét's name still whispers through documentaries, podcasts, and online forums. Her photograph, eternally 6 years old, continues to haunt the American imagination, a ghost of innocence frozen in lace and light, forever asking the question no one can answer. What really happened that night? Before the headlines and the whispered accusations, before the police lights turned their home into a stage, there was only the Ramsey family, ordinary in some ways, extraordinary in others. To understand the case that tore apart a family and obsessed a nation, one must first understand who they were before the morning of December 26, 1996. The Ramseys lived in Boulder, Colorado, a city that seemed almost idyllic in the 1990s. Nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Boulder was a place of intellectual curiosity and privilege. It was home to the University of Colorado, to a thriving culture of artists, academics, and entrepreneurs. Crime was rare, especially violent crime. People left their doors unlocked. The air was crisp, the mountains eternal. To live in Boulder was to believe you were safe. JonBenét Ramsey, born in 1943 in Nebraska, had built a life that embodied the American dream. A Navy veteran turned tech entrepreneur, he had founded Access Graphics, a computer distribution company that grew rapidly in the early years of the digital revolution. By 1996, his company was valued at over $1 billion. John was respected in his field, admired for his discipline and quiet ambition. He was a man who, from the outside, seemed to have everything: success, wealth, a beautiful home, and a loving family. Patsy Ramsey, born Patricia Paw in West Virginia, was a beauty queen in her youth, Miss West Virginia 1977. She had grown up with charm, faith, and a deep sense of presentation. The belief that beauty and poise were not vanity but grace. When she met John, she was radiant, social, the kind of woman who filled a room with laughter and energy. After their marriage, she poured her creativity into family life. Her home was her kingdom, decorated with seasonal grandeur, filled with warmth and artifice alike. Together, they had 2 children, Burke, born in 1987, and JonBenét, born in 1990. JonBenét's name was a fusion of her father's, JonBenét, and a touch of Patsy's flair for the theatrical. From the moment she was born, she seemed to embody her mother's vitality and her father's quiet intelligence. JonBenét was a bright, confident child. Those who knew her described her as kind, playful, endlessly curious. She loved dressing up, singing, and performing for anyone who would watch. Her beauty pageant photos, later plastered across every tabloid, were only one small facet of who she was. She liked candy, bedtime stories, and snow days. She was a child, but in many ways her life already belonged to the public. Patsy had introduced her to pageantry at the age of 4. In the small world of child beauty contests, JonBenét quickly became a star. She performed with practiced grace and a sparkle that judges adored. She wore sequins, lipstick, and crowns that glimmered under the stage lights. For Patsy, it was a way to share something beautiful with her daughter, a connection to her own youth, a celebration of talent and confidence. For others, even then, it stirred unease. The image of a 6-year-old in makeup dancing on a stage was unsettling to many who saw it. But in Boulder, Among the Ramsey circle, it was simply part of who they were, a family that lived large, loved tradition, and believed in showing the best of themselves to the world. Christmas was their favorite time of year. The Ramsey home transformed into something out of a storybook. Trees glittered in every room, lights twined along banisters, gifts stacked under bows. That December, they had hosted a holiday party that neighbors still remembered, filled with music, laughter, and the glow of a family seemingly untouched by darkness. JonBenét's life, though brief, was saturated with the trappings of privilege. The Ramsey home on 15th Street had 5 bedrooms, a wine cellar, and winding staircases. It was a place where a child could easily get lost in imagination, or as it would turn out, in something far darker. But even in that world of perfection, there were shadows that went unseen. Patsy had battled ovarian cancer only a few years earlier. A fight she'd survived, but that had left her fragile. She clung to her faith and to the image of family unity, as though it could protect her from life's uncertainties. Friends said she sometimes pushed herself too hard to maintain that image. Her insistence on order, presentation, and appearances could be intense. Yet few doubted her love for her children. John, meanwhile, had faced pressures of his own. The success of Access Graphics came with long hours and immense responsibility. He traveled frequently, balancing the demands of work and family. At home he was quiet, thoughtful, measured, a man who preferred logic to emotion. But he adored JonBenét. She was, as he would later say, the light in their house, a small, joyous spark that made even the grandest success feel meaningful. And then there was Burke, older brother, shy and analytical. He liked video games and tinkering with gadgets. He didn't share his sister's flair for the stage. In many photos he stands slightly apart, watching her shine. Yet by all accounts they were close in the way siblings are. Sometimes playful, sometimes competitive, but bound by a quiet affection. To their friends, the Ramseys were the picture of an American success story. Charitable, sociable, devoted to family and faith. They attended St. John's Episcopal Church regularly. They were generous with donations and hospitality. On Christmas Day 1996, they had spent time with friends, exchanged gifts, and planned to leave early the next morning for a family trip to Michigan. By all outward appearances, they were happy. That night, December 25th, JonBenét went to bed in her favorite white nightgown after nibbling on pineapple from the kitchen, a small, ordinary detail that would later become an eerie clue in the investigation. Patsy stayed up late preparing for their flight. At around 10 p.m., she went to bed beside her husband, exhausted but content. In the darkness of that house, snow falling softly outside, the Ramseys slept under the illusion that their world was safe. They could not know that within hours, their lives, and their daughter's name, would become part of one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. For a long time, Boulder remained stunned by what followed. This was not a city accustomed to violence, let alone the murder of a child in her own home. Reporters who descended on the town were struck by its contrast. The beauty of the mountains, the quiet dignity of the people, and the strange sense of disbelief that seemed to hang in the winter air. Neighbors struggled to make sense of it. Some recalled seeing police cars outside the Ramsey house that morning and thinking it must have been a misunderstanding. Others spoke of Patsy's scream echoing through the street, a sound so piercing that it made even those who barely knew her feel her anguish. For Boulder, the Ramseys had been part of a quiet elite, churchgoers, donors, a family admired. Now they were the epicenter of fear and suspicion. To outsiders, the case was a nightmare wrapped in contradictions, wealth and horror, innocence and deceit, beauty and death. But to those who knew the Ramseys, it was something even harder to bear, the collapse of a family they had believed was good. In the weeks before the murder, JonBenét had written a note for school, a small reflection on her Christmas wish. My hope is to be kind to everyone. It was simple, almost painfully pure. And in the aftermath of her death, that note, rediscovered by her teacher, became a symbol of everything that had been lost. Before the cameras, before the conspiracy theories, before the detectives began to turn on one another, there was just a family. One that looked like it had everything and then lost what mattered most. The morning of December 26, 1996, began in confusion and dread, the kind that feels unreal, like a nightmare one cannot quite wake from. At around 5:45 a.m., Patsy Ramsey descended the back staircase of her Boulder home, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. She had risen early to prepare for their planned family trip to Michigan. The plan was to leave around 7 a.m. to visit John's older children from his previous marriage. The house was quiet. The Christmas tree still glowed faintly in the front room. But when Patsy reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes caught something that made her heart stop. On one of the wooden steps, a few sheets of paper lay sprawled across the floor. A letter written in looping, frantic handwriting. As she began to read, the words burned themselves into her memory. Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business but not the country that it serves. The letter was nearly 3 pages long, rambling, dramatic, full of strange phrases and misspellings. It demanded exactly $118,000 in cash for the safe return of their daughter, JonBenét. The note claimed she had been kidnapped during the night, and warned the Ramseys not to call the police, not to speak to anyone, or she would be killed. Patsy's mind raced. She dropped the note and screamed for John. He came rushing downstairs, still groggy as Patsy's words came tumbling out. They've taken her. They've taken JonBenét within minutes. The Ramseys did exactly what the note forbade. They called 911, the dispatcher. Kim Archuleta later recalled Patsy's voice trembling. Panicked but oddly formal. She spoke quickly, gasping for breath, repeating that her daughter had been kidnapped and that there was a ransom note. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line, asking for details, but Patsy hung up abruptly after promising to wait for the police. At 5:55 a.m., the first officer, Rick French, arrived at the Ramsey home. Patsy met him at the door, still clutching the ransom note. She was in a frenzy, crying, pacing, her voice echoing through the cavernous rooms. John appeared more controlled, though his face betrayed shock. Officer French walked through the house, noting the odd stillness. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. He checked doors and windows. Everything was intact. Upstairs, JonBenét's bed was neatly made. There was no mess, no overturned furniture. The family story, that she had been taken from her bedroom during the night, didn't seem to fit the evidence. Then there was the note itself. 3 pages, written in black felt-tip pen on paper from a notepad found in the house. Its tone was theatrical, almost cinematic. It referenced a foreign faction, and even signed off with victory, SPTC, a phrase that made little sense to anyone. Investigators later said it read more like something out of a movie than a professional ransom note. But at that moment, none of that mattered. A child was missing and time was precious. The Ramseys began calling friends and family. Within an hour, several people arrived. Close friends, their pastor, and the family's lawyer. Soon the house was full. People gathered in the kitchen, whispering, praying, trying to comfort Patsy. Coffee brewed. Chairs scraped across the tile floor. The house, meant to be sealed as a crime scene, became crowded, contaminated. Officer French tried to control the situation, but his superiors soon arrived, unsure of how to proceed. It was Christmas week, a quiet time in Boulder. The police department had never handled a high-profile kidnapping before. Mistakes were made, ones that would prove fatal to the investigation. Detective Linda Arndt, the only detective on duty that morning, arrived around 8 a.m. She took charge, trying to piece together the timeline. The note said the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. to give instructions, but no call came. The hours dragged on. The family prayed, waiting by the phone. At one point, Detective Arndt suggested searching the house again just to be sure. Officer French had already looked through the basement but had missed one door, a small wooden panel latched shut in the back of the wine cellar area. He hadn't opened it earlier, thinking it was just storage. Around 1 p.m., Detective Arndt, feeling uneasy, asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to do a top-to-bottom search of the home to see if anything looked out of place. It was, by any standard of protocol, a grave mistake, allowing the father of the victim to search the house instead of police. John led Fleet to the basement, flashlight in hand. They walked through the cluttered rooms, old toys, boxes, and Christmas decorations scattered across the floor. Then, in the far corner, John noticed the small door. He opened it. Inside, the room was pitch black. The air was cold, and then he saw her. JonBenét lay on the floor, her favorite white blanket draped over her. She was wearing a white long-sleeve shirt and red velvet pants. Her hands were bound above her head with nylon cord, and another piece of cord was around her neck, attached to a handle from one of Patsy's paintbrushes. There was duct tape over her mouth. John froze. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Then he screamed, a raw guttural sound that shook the house. He lifted JonBenét's body, carrying her upstairs, shouting for help. Detective Arndt felt the blood drain from her face when she saw him. The child in his arms, lifeless, her head lolling. Patsy collapsed, screaming uncontrollably, her body shaking as she threw herself over her daughter. Arndt tried to clear the room, but it was too late. The scene had been completely contaminated. JonBenét was placed on the floor near the Christmas tree, the same tree where she had opened gifts the morning before. A doctor who lived nearby came at Patsy's request and confirmed what everyone already knew. She was gone. The ransom note was no longer a kidnapping. It was a murder. From that moment, the tone shifted. Boulder police, who had spent hours treating the case as an abduction, suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of a homicide. But the house was already compromised. Dozens of people had walked through, touched surfaces, moved objects. Crucial evidence was lost forever. The coroner arrived later that afternoon. JonBenét's body was taken away under the pale Colorado sky, the Ramsey house surrounded by flashing lights and silent neighbors. Reporters were already gathering outside. By evening, the news broke across national networks. A 6-year-old beauty queen found dead in her basement. No suspects, no clear motive. A ransom note, a wealthy family, and a crime scene that made no sense. In the coming hours, the world began to learn her name, and to form opinions long before the facts were known. That night, as the Ramseys stayed with friends, Boulder police sealed the home. Inside, the remnants of Christmas were frozen in time. Toys, wrapping paper, a half-eaten bowl of pineapple on the counter. In the basement, the spot where JonBenét had been found remained dark and still. The autopsy conducted the next day revealed more horror. JonBenét had been struck on the head, fracturing her skull. She had also been strangled. There were signs of sexual assault, though whether from the attacker or from later contamination would become a matter of fierce debate. The official cause of death: asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. The brutality of it shocked everyone. It was not the work of a typical burglar or kidnapper. It was personal. It was deliberate. Within 24 hours, Boulder police were split. Some believed the Ramseys were victims. Others were certain they were hiding something. Reporters camped outside their friend's home. Photographers followed every car, every movement. National networks demanded interviews. The tragedy had turned into a spectacle. Inside, the Ramseys barely spoke. Patsy clutched a Bible. John stared blankly into space. Burke was shielded from questions, confused and frightened. The world was already beginning to turn against them. And somewhere, buried under the noise of the cameras and the whispers of suspicion, The truth about what had happened that night began to disappear, like snow melting into the dark streets of Boulder. By the dawn of December 27th, Boulder was no longer just a college town nestled in the foothills. It was the epicenter of a storm. The death of JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old beauty queen in a mansion on 15th Street, had already ignited a national frenzy. But inside the Boulder Police Department, confusion reigned. From the beginning, the investigation was mired in uncertainty and human error. Officers who had arrived at the Ramsey home the previous morning were criticized for failing to secure the scene. Vital evidence had been trampled, moved, or lost. Fingerprints overlapped. Fibers were mixed. Even JonBenét's body had been carried upstairs, making a proper forensic examination almost impossible. Detectives began to argue, not just over the facts, but over what kind of case they were dealing with. Was it a kidnapping gone wrong? Or had the ransom note been a diversion from the start? Detective Linda Arndt, who had been the only detective on scene during those first crucial hours, later said she knew the moment John carried JonBenét upstairs that the case had changed. She could see something in the way he reacted, a calmness she couldn't explain mixed with a father's anguish. "In that instant," she said, "I knew the killer was in that house," but not everyone agreed. The Boulder Police Department was small, unaccustomed to high-profile crimes. Many officers had never investigated a homicide, let alone one that would attract the glare of the national press. They called in outside experts from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, but jurisdictional pride and distrust quickly poisoned their collaboration. At the heart of it all stood two competing theories. The first, championed by the lead detectives, was simple. Someone inside the house was responsible. The second, one favored by the Ramseys and their private investigators, was that an intruder had broken in and killed JonBenét. The battle lines were drawn before the evidence was even fully gathered. Inside the Boulder Police Headquarters, investigators pored over the ransom note again and again. It was long, unusually long, and written with a mix of confidence and carelessness that baffled handwriting analysts. Some phrases sounded sophisticated. Others seemed oddly childish or exaggerated. They noted the specific demand for $118,000, the same amount as John Ramsey's recent bonus. That detail couldn't be coincidence, they reasoned. It was either proof of an inside job or a remarkably informed outsider. The note had been written on paper from a pad found in Patsy's office. The pen used was also hers. A handwriting comparison was done between Patsy and the note's author. The results were inconclusive, but one analyst said privately that Patsy's handwriting could not be excluded. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. The basement windows were closed. A small grate in one of the window wells showed signs of being disturbed, but no footprints led to it through the fresh snow. There were cobwebs in the corners, undisturbed. An intruder theory began to look less and less likely to police. Detectives interviewed the Ramseys separately. Patsy appeared distraught, crying through most of the session, often deflecting questions or insisting she couldn't remember. John was more composed, choosing his words carefully, often redirecting to the supposed kidnappers. One of the first red flags came when officers asked why the Ramseys had called friends to their home during a kidnapping. Patsy insisted she needed support, that she couldn't bear to be alone. To investigators, it felt like an attempt to control the narrative, to surround themselves with sympathetic witnesses. And then there was the pineapple. In the kitchen, on the counter sat a bowl of pineapple chunks and milk. Inside JonBenét's stomach, undigested pineapple was found, eaten shortly before her death. Yet both John and Patsy claimed they hadn't given her any that night. In the background of a crime scene photo, a glass with a spoon was visible near the bowl. Fingerprints on it matched Patsy and Burke. Investigators began to wonder if JonBenét had come downstairs, after everyone had gone to bed, perhaps woken by noise or hunger, and encountered someone she knew. The autopsy added another layer of complexity. There was a severe skull fracture, 8.5 inches long, likely caused by a blunt object. The garrote, made from a broken paintbrush handle, had been used to strangle her. There was no sign of forced penetration, but there was evidence of irritation, suggesting either prior or post-mortem sexual assault. The killer had taken their time. Forensic evidence, though, was minimal. The nylon cord and duct tape yielded no fingerprints. The garrote's handle came from Patsy's paintbrush, but no one could prove when it had been broken. There were traces of male DNA found on JonBenét's underwear, but the technology at the time was too primitive to determine its origin. Then came the media. Within days, the case had exploded across national television. CNN, ABC, and tabloids across the country broadcast every rumor, every photograph, every whisper. The image of JonBenet in pageant attire, makeup, curls, and sequins became the face of the story. The media's obsession turned her from a child into a symbol of innocence corrupted, beauty destroyed. The coverage was relentless, and soon the court of public opinion had made up its mind. Either the Ramseys were hiding a terrible secret, or the police were railroading an innocent family. Inside the department, tempers flared. Detectives clashed with prosecutors over how to handle the Ramseys. The family hired attorneys within days of the murder, a decision that, while legally sound, made them look guilty in the public eye. They also brought in private investigators and a media consultant. By early January, the Ramseys appeared on national television. In a now infamous interview, John sat rigid beside Patsy, who clutched his hand, her face pale and drawn. She pleaded for the killer to be found, her voice trembling. "There is a killer on the loose. I don't want anyone to forget that." To some viewers, it was the cry of a grieving mother. To others, it sounded rehearsed. The police continued to dig. They searched the Ramsey home multiple times. They collected clothing, hair samples, and handwriting exemplars. Yet for every piece of evidence that pointed toward the family, another pointed away. For example, the DNA on JonBenét's underwear did not match John, Patsy, or Burke, nor did it match anyone in law enforcement or the family's friends. It was an unidentified male profile, a ghost in the machine of forensic science. Still, detectives remained convinced the answer was inside the house. They studied the timeline. Between the Ramseys' reported bedtime and Patsy's discovery of the ransom note, only a few hours had passed. If someone had broken in, killed the child, staged a kidnapping, and escaped unnoticed, all without waking anyone, it would have required almost supernatural stealth. Then came the question that haunted even the investigators themselves. If the Ramseys had killed their daughter, why would they stage such an elaborate note? Why not make it look like an accident or a break-in gone wrong? Why risk everything on a 3-page letter written by hand in their own home? Theories spiraled. Some detectives believed Patsy had written the note to cover up a fatal accident. Perhaps JonBenet had fallen and hit her head after an argument or a moment of rage. Others thought Burke had struck his sister, and the parents, panicked, had staged the scene. None of it was proven. The DA's office urged caution. There was no direct evidence, no confession, no eyewitness. Just inconsistencies, intuition, and the weight of suspicion. Meanwhile, the Ramseys' friends and church community closed ranks around them. They insisted John and Patsy were being unfairly vilified. At the same time, anonymous leaks from the police painted them as manipulative and evasive. The investigation, still in its infancy, had already fractured beyond repair, and in the midst of it all, the truth, whatever it was, slipped further away, buried beneath the noise, the pressure, and the growing obsession of a nation desperate for answers. By February 1997, only 2 months after JonBenét's death, the case was already at a standstill. The ransom note, the DNA, the garrote, the pineapple, the paintbrush. Each clue told a different story, but none told the truth. As winter turned to spring in 1997, the Ramsey case began to evolve from tragedy to spectacle. A story no longer confined to the halls of Boulder's police department, but one dissected on every television, talk show, and magazine cover in America. The name JonBenét Ramsey had transcended crime. It had become a brand of mystery, fascination, and quiet dread. The investigation, meanwhile, was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The Boulder Police Department was small, untested, and woefully unprepared for a case of this magnitude. The district attorney's office, led by Alex Hunter, clashed constantly with the lead detectives. Each side distrusted the other, police believing the DA was too soft on the Ramseys, and the DA believing the police had fixated too quickly on them. The result was paralysis. Evidence that could have been analyzed was mishandled. Leads that could have been followed were ignored. Witnesses contradicted one another. Experts disagreed on nearly every finding. At the center of the chaos was the ransom note, the longest ever found in a murder case of its kind. It was both theatrical and intimate, self-aware and absurd. It invoked patriotism, international espionage, and revenge, but then quoted phrases like, "Don't try to grow a brain, John." The letter's tone swung from menacing to mocking. To investigators, it was either the work of a deranged outsider or a carefully crafted lie from someone inside the home. Handwriting analysis became the obsession of early 1997. Dozens of experts examined samples from Patsy Ramsey. Some said the similarities were too close to ignore, and the slant, the loops, the formation of letters. Others cautioned that stress, fatigue, and emotional trauma could affect handwriting significantly. To the public, however, such nuance didn't matter. The idea that the mother, the glamorous, grieving woman seen weeping on television, might have written the note herself, ignited a firestorm. Tabloids called her a pageant mom gone mad. Late-night shows turned the tragedy into grotesque entertainment. Patsy became both villain and victim, a woman crushed by suspicion and spectacle alike. The Ramseys, advised by their lawyers, stopped cooperating with police interviews. They communicated through their legal team, hired their own investigators, and launched a public relations effort to restore their image. They appeared on CNN, gave exclusive interviews, and even published a book, The Death of Innocence, years later, a desperate attempt to reclaim their story. But in 1997, the damage was done. Public opinion had turned against them. Polls showed that most Americans believed one or both parents were responsible for JonBenét's death. Inside the investigation, two detectives, Steve Thomas and Lou Smith, became the embodiment of the division that tore the case apart. Detective Thomas, a young and idealistic officer, believed firmly in the family did it theory. To him, the evidence of staging was undeniable. The ransom note, the lack of forced entry, the DNA that could be explained as contamination, it all pointed inward. He became one of the loudest internal critics of how the case was handled, later resigning in frustration and writing his own book detailing the failures of the department. Detective Lou Smith, a veteran homicide investigator with an impeccable record, saw things differently. Brought in by the district attorney's office, he spent months re-examining the evidence and became convinced the Ramseys were innocent. To Smith, the signs of an intruder were clear. He pointed to a small basement window, one pane broken, the grate above slightly disturbed. He believed the intruder had entered through that window well, crept upstairs and attacked JonBenét while the family slept. He argued that the garrote and the complex staging of the crime scene were the work of a sadistic outsider, not a panicked parent. Smith also believed that the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing, unidentified, male, and consistent across multiple samples, was the key. To him, that DNA was the killer's signature. But others dismissed the finding. saying the DNA could have been transferred during manufacturing or handling of the clothing. The technology of the late 1990s wasn't advanced enough to draw definitive conclusions. By the time spring arrived, Boulder was suffocating under the weight of the case. Residents who once saw the Ramseys as neighbors now saw them as symbols of deceit, wealth, and privilege. Protesters occasionally appeared near their home, holding signs that read, "Justice for JonBenét." Reporters stalked every movement of the family. The Ramseys left Boulder that summer, returning to their former home in Atlanta to escape the pressure. But escape was impossible. Even as the official investigation stagnated, the case lived on in tabloids and television specials. Each new expert seemed to offer a new theory: that JonBenét had been killed during a botched ransom scheme, that she had been accidentally struck by Burke during an argument over food, that a sexual predator had broken in, obsessed with the child's pageant photos, that one of John's business associates had targeted the family for revenge. None of these theories held under scrutiny, but each added to the confusion until truth itself seemed like a mirage. In 1998, a grand jury was convened in Boulder to review the evidence. It was a secret proceeding, and the public would not learn what it had decided until years later. The jury heard months of testimony, from detectives, forensic experts, friends, and family members. They examined photographs, listened to tapes of the 911 call, and reviewed the autopsy report. But in October 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter announced there would be no indictments. He said there was not enough evidence to charge anyone with JonBenét's murder. What the public didn't know, what would only come to light more than a decade later, was that the grand jury had voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey for child abuse resulting in death and for accessory to a crime. But the DA had refused to sign the indictments, citing lack of proof. To the public, it seemed like another failure in a case already defined by failures. The years that followed were unkind. Patsy's health began to deteriorate again. Her cancer returned, spreading aggressively. Through it all, she maintained her innocence, telling friends she had no fear of meeting God because she had told the truth. John's business collapsed under the strain of scandal. He sold the Boulder house, moved his family, and tried to disappear from the media's relentless gaze. Burke, shielded from the public as a child, grew up in silence, carrying the invisible weight of suspicion that had shadowed him since he was 9 years old. Detective Lou Smith, meanwhile, refused to let go of the case. Even after retiring, he continued to investigate independently, gathering files, reanalyzing evidence, and chasing new leads. He believed the killer had left a trail, faint but real, in the DNA, the fibers, and the marks left behind. By the early 2000s, new forensic technology had begun to emerge. The DNA found on JonBenét's underwear was retested with more sensitive methods. The result confirmed what Smith had always believed. The DNA did not belong to any member of the Ramsey family. It belonged to an unknown male. That discovery, released in 2008, would lead the Boulder District Attorney's Office to issue a formal letter exonerating John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey of involvement in JonBenét's death. For some, it was vindication. For others, it was too little, too late. By then, the damage was irreparable. Patsy had passed away in 2006, never knowing who killed her daughter. She was buried beside JonBenét in Marietta, Georgia, mother and child reunited in death, their names carved into white marble beneath the shade of southern oaks. The case, though, remained open. The killer, whoever he was, had vanished into the American ether. And still the question lingered in the public's mind. Had justice been lost to error, ego, and time? Or was the truth something too unbearable to see? By the early 2000s, the world had changed, but the Ramsey case had not. It lingered like an open wound, a mystery replayed endlessly on late-night documentaries and internet forums, each claiming to hold the missing piece of the puzzle. For the Ramsey family, there was no closure, only endurance, and for investigators, there was only the quiet, grinding persistence of those who refused to let a child's voice fade into silence. Detective Lou Smith, now retired, became the case's last true believer. He was not a man who chased ghosts. He was methodical, devout, and analytical. Yet even as years passed, he maintained that someone had entered the Ramsey home that night, and that the clues were still there, buried beneath missteps and bias. In 2004, he presented his findings to a group of investigators and prosecutors, showing them photos of the basement window well, the one small, broken pane, the scuff mark on the wall beneath it, the suitcase found positioned directly under the sill. He argued it was not a coincidence. The killer had entered that way, he said, and escaped the same route. He believed the killer had spent time inside the home, perhaps watching the family, learning their routines. But even Smith's unwavering conviction could not resurrect a stalled case. Boulder's police leadership had changed. Most of the original detectives had retired or moved on. Evidence sat in storage, slowly degrading. Leads that once felt urgent had gone cold. Then, in 2006, a jarring announcement thrust the case back into the headlines. John Mark Carr, a 41-year-old American schoolteacher living in Thailand, confessed to the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, arrested by Thai authorities after a tip from a journalism professor who had been corresponding with him online. Carr claimed he had been present the night JonBenét died. He said her death was an accident, that he loved her, and that he had been with her when she took her final breath. The story exploded worldwide. Cameras flashed. Reporters called it the breakthrough the nation had been waiting for. After nearly a decade of speculation, there was finally a name. A man who had confessed in chilling detail. But within days, cracks appeared in his story. Carr's timeline didn't match. He had been living in another state at the time of the murder. His DNA didn't match the samples found on JonBenét's body. His confession was inconsistent and contradictory, full of fantasy rather than fact. He seemed to crave attention more than justice. When the results of the DNA test came back, proving he was not the killer, the case collapsed once more. Carr was released. The world turned its outrage toward the authorities who had flown him back to America in chains, only to realize he was a fraud. For the Ramseys, it was another cruel chapter in a saga that had no end. Patsy had died earlier that same year, after a long battle with ovarian cancer. She never lived to see Carr's confession. She had gone to her grave believing her daughter's killer would one day be found. After Carr's false confession, the case retreated once more into silence. But forensic science did not rest. In 2008, advances in DNA analysis allowed for new testing of the evidence collected from JonBenét's clothing. Tiny traces, once too faint to interpret, were now readable. The results were astonishing. The male DNA found on her underwear also appeared on the waistband of her long johns. Two separate items of clothing, same profile. It was not a random contaminant. The unidentified male DNA, belonging to no one in the Ramsey family or their acquaintances, became the strongest piece of evidence yet that an intruder had indeed been in that house. The Boulder district attorney at the time, Mary Lacey, took the extraordinary step of publicly exonerating the Ramseys. In her letter she wrote, "We do not consider the Ramsey family suspects in the death of their daughter. The DNA evidence clears them of any involvement. For many it was vindication, for others an outrage. Police officers who had devoted years to the family did it theory were furious, accusing Lacey of bowing to public sympathy. Critics claimed the DNA could have been transferred from factory workers who handled the garments before purchase. But to those who had lived through a decade of torment, the exoneration was a kind of mercy, fragile, incomplete but real. John Ramsey, now a widower, accepted the DA's letter with quiet dignity. "There's relief," he said softly in an interview. "But there's also sadness, because it doesn't bring her back, and it doesn't tell us who." As the years passed, the case took on a life of its own beyond law enforcement. True crime television turned it into mythology. Theories multiplied like echoes. Online forums dissected every word of the ransom note, every frame of the 911 call, every photograph of the Ramseys' home. Amateur detectives built timelines, suspects lists, and elaborate reconstructions. Some accused the police, some accused the parents, some even accused Burke, now an adult, despite his total exoneration by DNA. In 2016, 2 decades after the murder, CBS aired a documentary titled The Case of JonBenét Ramsey. Its team of experts, after reanalyzing the evidence, concluded that Burke Ramsey may have struck his sister in anger, and that the parents covered it up. The program sparked outrage. Burke, who had remained silent for 20 years, finally spoke publicly, giving a calm, strange interview on Dr. Phil in which he denied any involvement. He later sued CBS and the documentary producers for defamation, and won a reported settlement. Even as the media circus spun on, the investigation remained technically open. Lou Smith, before his death in 2010, had created a digital database of every piece of evidence, theory, and photograph from the case. His daughter and a team of retired detectives continued his work, quietly combing through tips and forensic possibilities. In 2021, nearly 25 years after JonBenét's death, renewed hope emerged. The Boulder Police Department, pressured by public demand and advances in forensic genealogy, the same technology that had caught the Golden State Killer, announced that they were reevaluating the Ramsey evidence for possible retesting. They planned to use modern genetic genealogy to trace the unknown male DNA through family trees, perhaps finally putting a name to the phantom who had haunted the case for decades. For John Ramsey, now in his late 70s, the announcement brought cautious optimism. "I've waited half my life for an answer," he said in a rare interview. "I don't care what it takes. I just want to know who did this to her." To this day, no match has been found. The unknown male profile remains in the FBI's CODIS database, a silent record waiting for the right name to cross its path. And yet, in some ways, the truth of the JonBenét Ramsey case may never belong to science alone. It exists somewhere between the evidence and the imagination, in the cracks of human error and the shadows of obsession. The aftermath of her murder reshaped how America viewed innocence, beauty, and tragedy. It exposed the failures of small-town policing under national scrutiny. It revealed how media could amplify both empathy and cruelty in equal measure. For Boulder, the memory still lingers like a ghost. The Ramsey home has changed owners several times, its windows curtained against curiosity. Neighbors say the house feels heavy and as if the air itself remembers. For the Ramseys, life never returned to normal. Patsy is gone. Burke lives quietly, his privacy fiercely guarded. John has remarried but carries a sadness that no passage of time can erase. He often visits the grave of his daughter and first wife, leaving flowers and the quiet prayer that someday, someone will tell him what happened. Perhaps one day, DNA genealogy will give the world an answer. Perhaps the truth is already known to someone who remained silent, burdened by guilt or fear, or perhaps, as some believe, the case has become too entangled in myth to ever yield clarity, a mirror of America's fascination with beauty and horror intertwined. But the facts remain. A 6-year-old girl, asleep in her bed, was taken from her world and killed in a home filled with warmth and love. No one saw. No one heard. The lights of Christmas still glowed in the windows that night, and when the dawn came, it revealed a darkness no one had imagined possible. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the morning Boulder awoke to the unthinkable. Time has softened the noise, dimmed the glare of television lights, and buried countless theories beneath new ones. Yet the story of JonBenét Ramsey remains, not simply as an unsolved murder, but as a reflection of something deeper in the American soul. For those who remember 1996, the image of JonBenét has never faded. She remains 6 years old, smiling in sequins, frozen in photographs that were never meant to be memorials. Her beauty pageant portraits became icons of loss, innocence tangled with tragedy. But behind the glitter and the headlines was a real child, curious, warm, and full of light. Her short life was not defined by how it ended, but by how deeply she was loved. The case has become a kind of mirror, one that reflects the intersection of privilege and suspicion, grief and performance, truth and myth. It revealed how easily a family could be transformed from victims into villains, how public hunger for answers can devour compassion, and how the machinery of media can distort even the most sacred pain. When the world first saw John and Patsy Ramsey pleading for help on television, few could have imagined that they would spend the rest of their lives pleading not for justice, but for belief. They were accused, scrutinized, and dissected in ways no family should endure. Each smile, gesture, and tear was examined as potential evidence of deceit. Every silence was branded as guilt. Even after their formal exoneration, many refused to let go of their suspicions. The idea that something so monstrous could come from within the safety of a family was more compelling and more terrifying than the notion of a faceless intruder. In that sense, the story of JonBenét became not just about who killed her, but about what Americans needed to believe. Some needed to believe evil could be explained, that it had a face, a name, a logic. Others needed to believe it could strike anywhere, that innocence itself could attract darkness. The tension between those beliefs is what keeps the case alive even. Now, but beyond all speculation lies the enduring silence of a child who never had the chance to speak for herself. The basement room where she was found, small, windowless, cold, and has become symbolic of the shadows that linger in all human hearts. It represents what happens when truth is locked away behind misunderstanding and pride. It reminds us that even in homes filled with warmth, there can be places we never look. JonBenét's death reshaped Boulder. The city that once prided itself on peace and intellect was forced to confront its fragility. In the years that followed, Boulder's police restructured, modernized, and trained in forensic science. It became a city more cautious, more alert, yet always haunted by what happened in that Tudor house on 15th Street. For investigators, the case remains both a burden and a lesson. It exposed how a single misstep, a contaminated scene, a rushed assumption, a leak to the press, can doom a search for truth. It became a textbook example for criminal justice courses, a cautionary tale told to new detectives about the price of error. And yet, amid all the tragedy and failure, there is a strange legacy of hope. Because even after 30 years, the world still remembers JonBenét. Her case inspired advances in forensic technology, new methods of cold case analysis, and the persistence of citizen investigators who refuse to let her story end. Each time a new name appears in the database, each time a lab test improves, her file is reopened, her name whispered once more in the hope that this time, the answer might come. John Ramsey still believes that day will arrive. In interviews, he speaks not of revenge, but of peace. "I just want to know," he says quietly. Not to punish, not to relive it, just to know. There is something profoundly human in that. The desire for truth not as victory, but as understanding. The truth, however, may be stranger and sadder than anyone expects. It may live in the margins of evidence, in the fleeting choices made by tired investigators, in the unseen fingerprints of someone who slipped away into the cold Colorado night. Or perhaps, as some have long suspected, it lives within the walls of that house itself, a secret buried so deep that time has erased its shape. But whether the killer was a stranger or someone closer, what endures is the wound when a wound in a family, a city, and a country that once believed such things could not happen here. The case of JonBenét Ramsey endures not because it is unsolved, but because it touches the places in us where innocence and darkness meet. It forces us to ask questions we cannot comfortably answer. About love. About fear, about the things people do to hide from both. Perhaps, in the end, the tragedy of JonBenét is not just the crime itself, but what it revealed about us, the public, the press, the institutions sworn to protect. It showed how quickly we turn curiosity into accusation, empathy into spectacle, and mystery into entertainment. And yet, despite all the noise, despite the endless speculation, there is still the child, 6 years old, forever, smiling in her Christmas dress. Her life, brief as it was, still commands remembrance. The truth about her death remains uncertain. But the truth about her impact is not. She became a symbol, not of horror, but of the need to keep searching, to keep believing that even in the coldest cases, the human heart refuses to give up. Somewhere, someone knows what happened in that house. Somewhere a memory lives that could unlock the silence, and maybe one day when science catches up with time, when conscience conquers fear, the world will finally know the answer to the question that has haunted it for 3 decades. Until then, the story remains suspended, a candle flickering in the dark, its flame fueled by remembrance. JonBenét Ramsey was more than a mystery. She was a child, and that truth, more than any theory, is what must never be forgotten.